Alright, this is study 7 of Galatians. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, verse 15 to 21. So we're going to finish Galatians 2. We're going to finish the biographical argument. But before we do, we're going to answer the questions from chapter 2, verse 11 to 14. The first question was about what Peter was doing. Peter was eating with Gentile believers in Antioch. He was treating them as brothers and sisters in the gospel family. They were equals. They were united in Christ Jesus. Question 2, what happened when the Judaisers came? Well, when they came up from Jerusalem, Peter stopped eating with the Gentile believers. He was afraid of those who were off the circumcision, it says. The other Jewish believers, influenced by this apostle's action, he was a disciple of Jesus, he'd walked with Jesus, he must be right. Well, they stopped eating with the Gentile believers as well. And even Barnabas eventually began to follow in their footsteps. Question 3, what does Paul call this? Paul called this hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is to act differently from what you know to be true. And these Jewish believers knew that Jews and Gentiles were made one in Christ Jesus and were made equal in the family of the gospel. Peter had even had a vision from God about all of this, and he was there when the first Gentile came to Christ. You can see all about that in Acts chapter 10. I would encourage you to go and read that chapter. Question 4, how did Paul respond? Well, Paul courageously and openly confronted Peter. Now, before you get the idea that you should go around openly confronting people all the time, remember a few things here. This was an open sin that everyone was taking part in and Peter was leading. And so Paul had to deal with it as a public sin. And second of all, this sin had the potential to undo the whole of the gospel family with permanent damage. And so Paul needed to confront this. Now, questions for chapter 2, verse 15 to 21. The rest of the chapter contains the argument that Paul used as he confronted Peter and the other Jews who had separated from their Gentile brothers and sisters. Now, it's a slightly challenging passage, verse 15 to 21. It can be hard to get your head around. So I'm going to give you a few notes to clarify, and then hopefully the questions will guide you, but there's always the answers tomorrow, so don't be worrying. So the first clarification, to be justified means to be declared righteous. And in this passage in Galatians, it means to be declared righteous before God. So to be in a right standing, a right relationship with God. Second of all, you'll see in verse 15 that Paul calls the Gentiles Gentile sinners, or sinners of the Gentiles. Because Gentiles didn't have the law of Moses, the Torah, the Jews considered them to be lawless or sinners. So that's going to help a little bit to understand that as you're reading the passage. And then third, Jews falsely believed that because they had the law, they were in right standing with God. So it's not necessarily that they kept the law, but simply that they had the law, that they were in right standing with God. You can see that argument, Paul gives that same argument in Romans chapter 2, helping them to see that that's not the case. So here's your questions. I hope that these are helpful. Again, this is a challenging passage, but hopefully the clarification will help. Hopefully the questions will help. And then again, the answers tomorrow, that'll help you as well, hopefully. So question 1, how were the Jewish believers made righteous before God? Verse 15 to 16. Question 2, this is the challenging bit. Peter had set aside the law and he was living with and as a Gentile. You'll see that in chapter 2, verse 12, verse 14 and verse 17. Now, if he went back to the law again and he built it up again as something that needed to be kept, what would that say about his time of living with and as a Gentile? Verse 17 to 18. So he lived as a Jew, thought he was righteous by having the law. Then he realized that he needed Christ, and he put aside the law and started living as a Gentile. Now, because of the Judaisers, he's beginning to set up the law again. By separating from the Gentile believers. What does that say about his life having lived as a Gentile person? Hopefully that's clear. Question 3, what has happened to Paul in Christ? Verse 19 to 20. What has happened to Paul in Christ? And then question 4, if you could be made righteous by keeping the law, then what does that mean about God's grace? And what does it mean about the death of Jesus in verse 21? God bless. And again, God bless this endeavor in this slightly difficult passage, and I hope it's a fruitful time of study for you.